Good morning, everyone. Today is day 14 of Make Your Own Sourdough Starter with me. And today is our last day. So you might want to see what the sourdough starter is looking like on our last day. This is where I did the test yesterday, which I'll show you in a minute. The sourdough starter is nice and bubbly. And it smells really wonderful. It's got an acidic smell because it needs to be fed this morning, but it's got a wonderful yeasty, wheaty smell to it. So it's doing really well after 2 weeks. And most sourdough starters will stabilize after about 2 weeks. However, some take less time and some take a little bit more time. So if you've tried to make bread and your bread came out, a little bit on the flat side, then keep feeding your starter, and it might take a couple more days to stabilize. So we'll go ahead and feed our starter this morning on our last day. We'll take out all but about 30 grams. I think you know pretty good by now how it works. We'll put in 60 grams of water. And we'll put in 60 grams of our flour, which is an all-purpose and whole wheat mixture, 50-50. And we'll give it a good vigorous stir. Incorporate a little bit of oxygen in there, which helps jumpstart it a bit. Now, you've heard me say before, it doesn't have to have oxygen, but it does like it. So then I'll put my lid on, and well, at this point you can either put it back at room temperature and leave it setting out and use it, or you can start refrigerating it now. Now that it's stable, you can go ahead and refrigerate it and then take it out when you want to bake. You would take it out the day before you want to bake, and you would feed it once or twice, or however many times it takes to get nice and bubbly again. And then you'd go ahead and feed it enough to use it for your formula. You would If you're keeping it in the refrigerator, you would want to feed it at least once a week. You just take it out, discard some, and feed it and put it back in. And that will help keep it healthy and ready to go for when you want to bake. I know that some people do neglect their starters and they won't feed them for a month or 2 months, and they can actually still bring them back. But if you do that, then it won't be ready for baking when you need it. You'd have to feed it for several days before you could use it again. And so yesterday I told you that I was going to do a test of the starter yesterday after I fed it. So I want to show you what happened. Let's see. First off, this is what we had for the very first test that we did. This was, I don't remember which day it was. It was day 6, I think, or 4. We did a test to see how the starter was doing. And this is how it was doing. It peaked at 4 hours, and then at 6 hours, after that it began to fall. And yesterday, this is what the starter did. It seemed like it had a slightly more slow growth, but it actually made it to 6 hours. And I came in a little while after I took that picture, and it had already fallen. So it was just at 6 hours when it fell. And when it fell, it looked like this here. It fell back to the 4-hour mark, and then it pretty much it went up a tiny bit for the 8 and 10 hour mark. It made a slight rebound, and then it pretty much stayed there. And this morning it was around the, if I would have had a 3-hour mark, it was around the 3-hour mark. So the starter's doing really well. It not only hit the 6-hour mark, but it has some staying power. It's actually, it's not falling back completely right after it's peaking. So it has some staying power, which is really good. You don't want your bread to rise and then just, fall really quick. So there we go. Some other things I wanted to say this morning before we finish up is that at this point, if you want to make like a whole wheat starter, because you want to make like 100% whole wheat bread, and you want to use your 100%, you want your starter to also be whole wheat, then you can take your starter that we made over the last 2 weeks and you can turn it into other types of starters. You can get another container, scoop some out of your starter, the starter container that you're using, and you can put some in a new container and start feeding it a new flour. Like perhaps you would like a rye flour starter, or perhaps you would like a spelt starter. Whatever kind of starter you would like, just take some, put it in a new container, and start feeding it the new flour. The only thing is every once in a while, when a starter gets fed new flour, it might either not be bubbly or active right away, or it might be extra active right away. The starter can change a little bit because it's being fed new food. And just like us, if we suddenly change our diet, sometimes we're not real happy about it either. But if you feed it for, a couple times, it'll be fine. You could also, if you want to, potentially feed it half of the old starter that you were doing. Like for instance, this is half white and half wheat. And so if I made a wheat flour out of it, a wheat starter out of it, it will do just fine because it's used to the wheat. If I wanted to make a rye starter out of it, I might want to use like half white and half rye for a couple of feedings and then switch over to all rye. But if you choose not to do that and you just start feeding it rye, it should take off. It should do just fine. So let's see, I wrote down a few other things that I wanted to say. So changing your starter to a new flour, I talked about that. No feeding it other things. If you want to experiment with your starter and feed it other things like honey, milk, sugar, some people, read about those things and they want to try it. My recommendation is to take some of your starter, put it in a new container, and experiment with it in a new container. And then keep your original starter the way that we made it, with just the water and flour. Because sometimes when you add those other ingredients, it will spoil the starter or ruin it. So you don't want to ruin your original starter. So just take a little bit and experiment with it. Okay, so like I already mentioned, at this point you can keep it in the fridge if you want and start feeding it maybe once a week and taking it out when you're ready to bake. Now that it's stable, it should perform pretty well for you. You should be able to bake bread or just about anything else. So I can't think of anything else that I need to remember to share with you. I think I've covered just about everything. And so I'm going to check the questions now and see if there's any questions that need to be answered. And then we'll call it a day. And actually we'll call it 2 weeks because we're done. I'm really hoping that you all have some wonderful starters and that you're real happy with them and that you're baking some wonderful bread. Check on day 12. We made bread, and I have a formula there, so go ahead and try that formula out and see if you like it. Sarthak says, since we reached the end, what do you plan on doing next? Wait a minute, that's farther down. Paul from the UK says, do you always cover your dough in the oven? What are some tips for those of us without Dutch ovens or very deep trays? Is a good result achievable without covering? I'd have to say outright no, Paul. You need some sort of steam. If you absolutely have no steam and you can't make steam, you could cover your dough with oil. That would help the dough to still stretch when it's doing its oven spring. But if you don't have something, what will happen is that your dough will crust over quickly in your hot oven, and it will keep the inside of the dough from rising up. So instead of getting a good oven spring, you'll have a dense loaf with a hard crust on it. If it blows out the side, you'll still have an unpleasant loaf, and your crust very often will look ugly, and so you need steam. You can get away with using oil or melted butter or ghee, and that really does help, but in my opinion, it's not quite as good as steam, although it will work. So yes, you do need something that will help you make steam in your oven. Nightlight says, my oven's top setting is rather unhelpfully labeled at max. That's terrible. I bought an oven thermometer and it seems to max out at 225 Celsius, 437 Fahrenheit. Is this hot enough to achieve a good sourdough, or am I wasting my time? 437 is really borderline there. It would make some good soft breads, you know, the soft loaves that people like. You would make good sweet breads, breads with sugar, breads with oil or butter in it. I think you would have a hard time getting a good lean sourdough, one without anything in it except for flour and water, because at that lower temperature you'll have to leave it in longer. The crust will be thick and heavy. So unfortunately, it seems to me like you really should work on getting a new oven, or you'll have to stick with the enriched breads that have some fat, oil, and or sugar in it, and those can be baked at lower temperatures. So sorry, but if you want to bake some really good hearth artisan breads, you need a hotter oven. If it were me and it was my oven though, I would experiment with it. I would just experiment and see what I could do with it. So go ahead and experiment and see what you can do with it. Seema says, but after the lid's off, I reduce the temperature to 200 Celsius. That's not really a question, so I'm not sure what you're wanting me to say there. Irene says, my first loaf made from my new starter is wonderful, crisp crust, big holes, chewy and delicious. I'm thrilled. Thank you. Oh boy, that sounds wonderful, Irene. I'm so glad to hear that. Brian says, I started watching during day 7. I went back to binge watch it all. Oh, how nice. Thanks. Great videos. Thank you, Brian. I really like hearing that. That really makes it worthwhile. Irene asks, do the microbes in the starter come only from the flour, or does the starter pick up others from the air or in their surroundings? I know there's a debate about that, and I believe that they've done experiments where they've sterilized the flour, and that the flour basically just doesn't really want to ferment. I think the flour could pick up yeast from the surroundings. As we all know, there's yeast and microbes all around us. We're in a soup of microorganisms. But I think the majority of the microorganisms for a sourdough starter come from the grain. Just like when people make yeast water, the lactic acid bacteria and yeast come, they coat the organic matter, whether it be fruit or flowers. Wine is made using the yeast that cover the grapes. So I think that the microorganisms necessary cover the grain, and that's personally why I like to use just the grain to make a starter, because in my opinion, the microorganisms that are coating the grain and that get ground into the flour are the ones that are most suitable for making bread. Just like the yeasts coating the grapes are probably the most suitable for making wine. Maybe not always, who knows. Okay, Sarthak says, since we reached the end, what do you plan on doing next? I would suggest you should upload edited videos of different sourdough breads of the world. Like the big deal loaves of each country. I know it's a lot. Sarthak, I'm not really quite sure what I'm going to do next. I have a new membership site called the Baking Network, and I'm working on that. I've been adding a lot of new formulas to it, and workshops and videos, and lots of content, and it's been taking up a lot of my time, and I'm really enjoying it. I also have 11 baking courses on Udemy and on Zenler, which you can get through the baking. You can get the courses on Zenler through the Baking Network. If you want to take any of my baking courses on Udemy, go to my site, northwestsourdough.com, because I have discount coupon links there. So all of my courses are discounted from that site. I will probably, since I love baking sourdough so much, I will probably continue to come up with new formulas and possibly another event series like this. And the sky's the limit. I'm not sure what I'll do, but I'm sure that I'll do something. Thanks for asking. Brian says, I've started feeding a small portion of mine with semolina. I did it over a 3-week period, but I did it in the fridge. It has been great. You see, I lost that. Just a minute. Okay. I did it over a 3-week period, but I did it in the fridge. It has been great. I may try restarting it with this method at room temperature. I believe that, Brian, I believe that doing a starter in the fridge is a perfectly good thing to do. It just takes longer. I think that it will ferment in the refrigerator just fine. It will just take a long time. So basically, if you have it in the fridge, just take it out and put it at room temperature, and it may need a little adjustment period, but I think it'll do fine. Sherry says, thank you for a wonderful experience. See you in 101 and beyond. The next course that you may want to take after this is Sourdough Bread Baking 101, which will teach you how to, more tips and techniques for sourdough bread. However, most of you that have gone through this will be able to go right on to my course number 2, artisan bread baking for professionals. So you may want to just go ahead and start with that one. Either one's fine. In 101, you'll still learn more tips and techniques. Can you make pizza with this starter? Yes, you can make virtually anything that you can make with commercial yeast. You can make with a sourdough starter. Sometimes it takes a little tweaking. Some breads are actually better suited to a sourdough starter, and some types of breads are actually better suited to commercial yeast. So, but yes, you can make pizza with your sourdough starter. I do have a pizza course, and you can look up pizza formulas probably on Google. I do have some pizza formulas also on my site, I think, and in my book. My Discovering Sourdough book is 400 pages, and it's available on Amazon. It's 4 volumes because it's so large. You can also find it in my Etsy shop, but if you look up Discovering Sourdough in Google, you'll find it. So on Etsy, it's available as PDF, and you can download it and print it out. On Amazon, it is only available as a Kindle or to read on your computer, and you can't print it. So you might want to think about what you want to do with it when you look for it. Any suggestions on where to find recipes we can use our starter in? Absolutely. Like I just mentioned, my book has a lot of formulas in it. I have 2 sites, the Baking Network and Northwest Sourdough. I have a group on Facebook called Perfect Sourdough, and there are thousands. It's the largest sourdough bread baking group probably in the world, and it's got a lot of bakers there that share their formulas. There's formulas in the files. You can find formulas all over the internet. You can Google file, the formulas. So there's a lot available out there to you. Brian says, my current starter is 187 years old, but I never really learned how to maintain it. Your videos have been informative. Remember that in several of the videos that I did in the last several days, I told you about my book, Make Your Own Sourdough Starter. You can also get that on Amazon, but it's available for free on both of my sites, which I already mentioned, and there should be links under this video in the discussion area. So you can download Make your own sourdough starter, and it's a free download, and you can find out, it has day by day how to take care of your starter. It has how to make mother doughs. It has how to care for your starter, how to keep it healthy, how to dry it, how to freeze it. So basically what I followed in this live series is in the book. So if you want the book, you can get a paperback copy on Amazon, or you can download it for free. Just go to either one of my sites. And there are links in the discussion area under the video. Okay, that's really cool that you have a starter that's 187 years old, and I don't know if you kept it in your family or not, but that's always nice to hear that your sourdough starter can last so long. Ariel says, after feeding the sourdough, should you leave it at room temperature for a while, or can I put it in the refrigerator right away? Will it become more sour if I put it in the fridge right away? Ariel, that depends upon what you want to do with it. If you want to feed your starter this morning and use it this afternoon for baking bread, I would recommend just leaving it out at room temperature. Usually you would feed it and put it right back in the refrigerator right away if you are not intending to use it very soon. Anytime you want to jump start it, you can leave it at room temperature for a couple hours or until you use it. Will it become more sour? Sour is, I know a lot of people think that if they have the right starter, or if they handle the starter just the right way, it will make sour bread. But it's really the technique of when you make your bread. It's the technique you use that will make a sour loaf. If you want to find out what technique I use that is very successful for making a good sour loaf, get my course, Bake Real San Francisco Sourdough Bread, and you'll find out what techniques to use to make a good sour loaf. Sochik says, how can I standardize my starter to 100% hydration? I'm not really sure what you mean about how to standardize your starter, but if you always just feed it the same weight of flour and water, it will be 100% hydration. So just anytime, if you have a lower hydration mother dough and you want to make a 100% hydration starter out of it, you can use dough calculators, or you can just take a little bit of the lower hydration mother dough, put it in some water, break it up and disperse it, and then start feeding it at 100% by using the same weight of flour and water, and that will make a 100% hydration starter. Jeannie says, thank you, appreciate your time and knowledge. You're so welcome, Jeannie. I had a lot of fun doing this. Lawrence says, what heat should I bake sourdough? Usually for baking sourdough, it needs a lot of heat. Even if you make waffles or pancakes, you usually have to heat your griddle hotter than usual. The oven, when I do a preheat of the oven, it's usually at around 480 degrees Fahrenheit to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. And sometimes I'll lower it to 450. Other times I leave it at 480 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the whole bake. So it needs some pretty good heat to get a good oven spring and nice color. And it's just the nature of sourdough. It needs that heat. Paul from UK, you can spray water in the oven, preheat a baking dish with stain. Okay, Ariel is telling Paul some things that you can do if you don't have steam. She says you can spray water in the oven, preheat a baking dish with stainless steel screws or old cutlery in the oven when you put the bread in. There are lots of ideas for getting steam. You could ask in the group Perfect Sourdough on Facebook. You'll get lots of advice there. You could make a cloche or some type of a lid out of tin foil. You can use an old stainless steel bowl and turn it upside down over your bread. There's really, some people will take a regular bread loaf pan and then put their dough in it, and then put another loaf pan upside down over the top loaf pan. So there's just lots of things that you can do to get steam for your bread. Rocio says, hello, my test bread will be going in the oven soon. It doesn't look springy. What did I do wrong? Leave it out a little longer. You have a new starter. It might still be a little bit on the slow side. Leave it out and let it do its final proof until it does look springy and it does look ready to go in. So I would just say leave it longer. Let it do a longer final proof. Tony, do you have baking books? Yeah, I mentioned that. So let's see. The name of my Etsy shop is Pixie Bakery. It's called Pixie Bakery. I should change that to Northwest Sourdough, but it's Pixie Bakery. Is there a rule of thumb on how to convert commercial yeast recipes to using sourdough starters? Basically, most sourdough starters are the average ones. And I'm not talking about low inoculation, but an average formula has 20 to 30% of the flour weight as starter. So you can basically use that as a rule of thumb. Other people do have printed, so I can put them in a binder. All of my courses have the formulas as printable PDFs. So if you take the courses, all of the different formulas can be downloaded and printed out. Amgad says, I managed to make my starter, but after a month I forgot to feed it once and it had a bad smell and a dry surface. Does that mean I lost it? No, that doesn't mean you lost it. Sourdough starters are very hardy. All you have to do is peel off the hard surface, discard most of it, or else take a little bit of starter from the bottom of the jar, put it in a new container and start feeding it again. It should bounce right back. So sourdough starters actually take a lot of neglect. I wouldn't recommend neglecting them if you want them to serve you well, but they will take neglect, and you can usually get them to bounce back by removing a little and you start feeding it again. So Chick says, thank you. You're welcome. Lawrence says, thank you. You're so welcome. Mircusi says, thank you for the series, Teresa. There was so much useful information here. Much appreciated. You're welcome. Becky says, you're a very good teacher. The knowledge you're passing on will benefit generations of bakers and those who eat what has been baked. Well, I really hope so. Thank you, Becky. Brian says, I put a pan on the bottom rack with an inch of water in it to provide steam. Just watch your eyes when you open the oven. Okay, so there are other people giving advice on how to create steam in the oven. And Rocio says, thank you for this live series. I've enjoyed this and can't wait to bake more. Well, that's all of the questions, and I just want to say thank you so much for joining me with this live event for 2 weeks, and I hope your starter's doing wonderful. I can't wait to see your bread. Please post it in Perfect Sourdough on Facebook, and if I have another live series, I'll announce it and let everybody know. But thank you so much, and have a lot of fun baking. Bye-bye.